Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about generating SDKs using OpenAPI definitions and what some best practices are. I'm Sid Maestri, VP Developer Relations at APIMatic, where we help API companies automate the creation of SDKs and everything that goes along with them. So let's start by defining what is an SDK, because when we hear that term, I think we quite often picture the code library itself. The thing that we type npm install and get, that is often equated with an SDK, which is really the heart of any software development kit. But there also are many artifacts that come along with it, including your SDK reference, which explains all the methods and parameters and everything that goes into using that code library, a getting started guide to help you configure and utilize that code library, code samples that demonstrate how to use each of those methods. Often that's part of your reference docs. Use case guides that illustrate how to accomplish specific business tasks through a series of API calls that leverage your SDK, and quite often complete sample apps or starter projects that developers can fork or download, drop in their API keys, and get a fully functional example of how to use your API through a software development kit. So it's more than just those code libraries for sure. And an important question we should probably ask ourselves is, why do developers want SDKs? And there are definitely those extremely skilled, talented developers, those senior ones who may have their own tools that they don't need SDKs and they don't really want to leverage them. That's totally understandable. And then there's the other side of the spectrum, those citizen, no-code, low-code developers who aren't really capable of utilizing an SDK. But in between those two extremes, there is a huge majority of developers who actually love to find their language being supported for your API. You can speak their language by providing those SDKs and code samples and code libraries. So I think Stripe actually says it best when they say that the reason that they provide SDKs is because it reduces the boilerplate code that developers have to write. And that reduction in common code that everybody needs to use to integrate with an API needs to be written, it needs to be supported. We need to look for security vulnerabilities and patch those. And as an API changes, having those updates be automatically rolled into your toolkit through an SDK is a really nice advantage. So it saves developers a lot of time writing the same code for every single API they encounter. Also, developers find that with a well-crafted SDK, they can achieve this state of flow. They don't have to jump back and forth between their IDE, their coding environment, and some REST API reference docs. Don't get me wrong, those reference docs are important, but if you can provide an experience where they're using an installed library that provides inline documentation, code completion, code hinting, where the methods have names that are very intuitive, the parameters are strongly typed so they know that they need to pass in a number or a date or a string. That's all helps them be more productive and get into the rhythm of coding. And you can create entire developer experiences around your SDKs. Stripe does this very well with this custom payment flow use case guide, where they have the ability to select different languages, both on the front end and back end, and download fully operational apps but also a step-by-step tutorial all built around these SDKs that they've built. Now, how are people building SDKs today? Just this year, we did a survey and we looked at 100 API companies that offer SDKs, and we found that around 60% in our sampling are still handwriting their SDKs from scratch. They're homegrown, as we like to call them. But interestingly, we found 34% were using some kind of code generation to build their SDKs and that overall experience. And the most popular API definition format is OpenAPI among the companies that we looked at. So why are companies choosing code generation over handcrafting their SDKs today? Well, I'd point out that there are several benefits in generating SDKs using OpenAPI. You have a single source of truth. So if you want to update multiple languages, multiple SDKs, you can update your OpenAPI definition in one place and then roll those updates out simultaneously to multiple languages. You can build your documentation and SDKs as part of your overall CI/CD pipeline. Those updates are definitely going to be more accurate and less time consuming. If you think about it, when you have to change your API, those changes have to roll out into not just the code library, but also to any documentation, code samples, etc. And so there's lots of opportunity to miss an update in one area and frustrate developers. And most importantly, we've got limited resources, and those engineering resources can be focused on building new features, new APIs, instead of building those SDKs for you. Now, if you're looking for tools to use with your OpenAPI definition, I would definitely recommend checking out tools.openapis.org. They've got a whole catalog, different categories of tooling available. And if you aren't already using a validation or some kind of linting tool, you'll definitely want to explore that. If you use something like Swagger Editor, it does a lot of inline validation and linting as you're editing your API definition. Or you might be using some sort of project like Spectral, which can be part of your CI/CD pipeline, or you're using a CLI tool to validate your API definitions. But I want to mention that there's some challenges around these existing tools because they are optimized for linting and validation for documentation and not necessarily for generating code. And so today's talk is the 5 pitfalls that you want to avoid when working with OpenAPI and generating SDKs. And a little bit like Indiana Jones, we're going to go on an adventure. We're going to avoid these pitfalls in order to reach the ultimate prize, which is high-quality, robust SDKs. So our first pitfall that we want to avoid is the missing operation ID. So what happens if you leave this out? Well, if you leave it out of your, in this case, we've got an example YAML file for a pet store. What the code generator will do is it will try to figure out what to name that method. And in this case, it's grabbing the summary and concatenating all of that text together to make the name of your method, which is not very intuitive and a little bit long, in my opinion. But if you add that operation ID, what you've provided to the code generator is the name for the method that you believe is going to be most intuitive to the developer. Now, Spectral will catch a missing operation ID and give you a warning. So that's good, as long as we're paying attention to those warnings. A good tip for when you name those operation IDs is to call it a verb resource combination, less than 30 characters, something like create pet or list pets if it's plural. Our second pitfall that we want to avoid is missing tags from operations. Now this might seem innocuous enough, right? We just forgot to put a tag in there, no big deal. Well, if you do this for your entire API definition, then what will happen is all those untagged operations will get grouped together in a generic class called something like API controller, for example. And that could have hundreds of methods in there. So when a developer types in to their IDE API controller dot, they're going to get this massive list of methods, and it's very hard to find what they're looking for. The better pattern to follow is to add those tags, and when you do that, and the code generator generates a unique class called pets controller, it might only have a handful of related methods that you've designated to group together for the benefit of the developer that's using it. Spectral will give you a warning if you're missing that tag, so that's good that we're catching that and giving you a warning about it. In naming tips for our tags, identify those ideal groupings, pluralize the names unless they are actually a singleton resource. So something like pets controller is a good example. Now, our third pitfall that we want to avoid is poorly written or omitted descriptions completely. Now, I know this is a real challenge sometimes. I don't always write the best descriptions, but it's good to do that because all of these different tags and properties need descriptions. It's going to make your documentation more readable and robust, and it will provide some of that inline documentation that we saw. Spectral, unfortunately, only catches about half of these properties when they're missing. There's several more that don't catch a missing description. As I mentioned, tips for good descriptions, instead of calling it just like a list response, be more descriptive. It's a paged array of pets that are being brought back. Avoid just short descriptions that don't add any value. Now, our fourth pitfall that we want to avoid is defining objects or enums in line. This is something I'm guilty of, and if you do it, the code generator is going to be really challenged. I've gotten classes created called inline 200 response, which developers don't know what to do with. So here's an inline array that was defined in our API definition, and the code generator does its best. It comes up with pets response. But a list of pets response is probably not as intuitive as calling a list of pet objects. So if you abstract that inline pet to a reference, to a component, then it's going to generate a uniquely named class for you. Again, sorry, Spectral doesn't catch this with their standard rule set. So our tips: basically, make it a singular unless it represents a collection, and don't attach a schema type to it. Like I've called things like pet object or pet string. We don't want to do that. It's just a pet. So let's keep it simple for developers. And our fifth and final pitfall that we want to avoid is those missing examples. This is really easy to skip over, to think, oh, an example is just a nice to have. But when it comes to code generation, having examples on your parameters, your request body and content, your schema properties, these are all very valuable. And where do they show up? Well, they're going to show up in your documentation. So in this situation, I've generated some documentation, but I didn't put in any examples. And the code generator does its best. It gives me a name called name6, and it puts it in there, but that's not a really great name, and it leaves out the pet type. It doesn't even select a default for me. But if I put in a good example, like the dog's name is Indiana, then you can see both in the documentation and the code sample on the right, there is using a well-formed name that represents that property as well as the pet type being a dog. And also, those examples can be used to generate test cases. So if your code generator will generate tests for you, those examples can be used to populate your tests. Now again, Spectral doesn't catch these rule sets, which is unfortunate. Now, when it comes to SDK generators, I won't go into depth about that today. Clearly, I'm from APIMatic, and we offer an SDK generator, which is great. There's open source options as well as other commercial code generators. I strongly recommend that you develop some criteria to evaluate these different options and take the time to put them through their paces, generate code in multiple languages, and try them out and see how they feel. Are they idiomatic? Do they feel native to the developer? Is there a good getting started or README generated along with it? Is it going to handle, network errors and robust, any kind of network failures or API errors? Is it handling those gracefully? Are the code samples generated? Are they runnable? Put it through their paces and really evaluate them well. And with that, I'll just leave you. No, I'm kidding. I don't want to leave you like Indiana facing this cobra. With the existing linting tools out there, you're going to be forced to remember all these rules I've shared with you today, all these pitfalls, and try to catch them all yourself. So to help, APIMatic actually has a new VS Code extension. It's not in the marketplace, it's pre-release only, but I'll give you a link at the end so you can go and download and try it out yourself. But I thought I'd give you a quick demo so you can see what's possible with using this extension to catch those errors in our OpenAPI definition. All right, so here I am in VS Code, and I have the APIMatic extension installed. And I'm going to click Open a New Workspace. I'm going to go into API World, to my presentation, and I am going to open up an empty folder here. Now, once you're in your designated folder, you want to import your existing API definition. So I've got that in another folder next door, so I'll just go and grab that. And it immediately does a validation for me and tells me what my warnings, what my errors are, as well as linting. So the linting is sort of the summary of all 6. I also have this option to generate a report in PDF format. So I'm going to give my report a name, and it's been successfully generated. So I'll go in here into API World, go into my Prezo, and I'll open up my validation report. And here we can see all the details about each one of these. I can jump down and see what's happening. So as we can see, we've got a missing operation ID, an operation object, a tag is missing. Oh no, we've got an inline schema. We've got our examples are missing, and we have a description missing. We also have I added a poorly named operation as well. So let's go and find that missing operation ID. So if I click on that, it takes me to line 22, and it says we're missing our operation ID here. Now, I could go through these one by one and fix all of these, but a nice feature of this extension is it has an auto fix feature. So I've got 6 errors. Let's see what happens when I hit auto fix. I can see the output from my log that it successfully fixed some things, and if I hit save all, my linting errors went from 6 to 3. So what linting errors remain? Well, we're missing a tag here, so I need to go in and manually fix this. So I'll put in here tags, and I'm going to put in pets, and I'll hit save, and now the error goes away. I'm missing my example here. Oh, so I have to go in here for my pet, and I have to go in here and put in an example. And my example is an ID. It has a name. I'll call it Fido. And we have a pet type. And that's going to be, what is the pet type going to be? My pet type is going to be a dog. And I'll save that example. And lastly, I have a missing description. So here we have an array of pets. Now, I do want to mention that when we auto-fix things, we should always double check and make sure that we fix things properly. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to take a look for that operation ID. So here this new operation ID was created, again, based off the summary, because that's all the code generator had to work with. I don't think that's a great name. So I'm going to go ahead and here and I'm just going to call it create pet because I like that operation ID better. The other thing that got auto-fixed was we had an inline schema called for our pet type. And so it generated a new global type called pet type, actually pet type. So I don't really like that name. I think pet type is better. So I'm going to go and change that in one place and then I'll change it here as well. Now this might seem like a mistake from the auto fix, but in reality, if I had an inline property called status, then calling it invoice status might make a lot more sense because there might be other status properties on other objects that need to be put into a global namespace, and you can't have more than one status in that global namespace. So pet type is actually quite reasonable when generating these moving these inline components into a global namespace. Now, what else can we do with this? Well, we can actually transform our specifications and we can upload them directly to APIMatic. Now, if I click transform, then I can actually, well, normally it would ask me for my API key, but I've already entered it. But you can choose all these different formats to take your OpenAPI and transform it to, like a Postman collection. And if I select that, it's going to take a second and it's going to generate a new file that is a Postman collection that I can then use to import or provide to my developer audience. And lastly, I can export this straight to APIMatic. And if I come in here, and I exit my slides and come into the APIMatic dashboard and hit reload, we can see I have my new pet store API was created using my API definition. I can generate a brand new developer portal with it, along with SDKs in 7 different languages. And if I come in here, I can check my different endpoints like creating a pet. It has, my curl example, as well as different languages that I can select. So lots of options here. I will just end that demo part of my talk, come back to the slideshow, and just wrap up by telling you about some more of the validation extension features. We talked about transforming. You can create custom rules. You can disable rules as necessary. So very flexible. And also, the autofix that I showed, right now it autofixes 5 specific things like missing operation IDs or invalid operation IDs. It also grabs those inline schemas and puts them into global components and adds missing API descriptions. So there's lots of fixes. There's more planned. And if you'd like to, like Indiana, go and grab the treasure, you can head on over to this tiny URL and grab Fix My Spec. You can download it into your VS Code and give it a try with your API, OpenAPI definition. If you have questions about anything I've shared today, anything about generating code, anything about OpenAPI and how to leverage that, please drop me an email, find me on socials, and I hope that you all have a great rest of your conference.